Okay, thank you for the presentation, and it's good to see you, everyone, in this online workshop. I'm going to talk, as it was already explained, about my part of my master thesis. I am only going to focus in this case in the macroeconomic policy regimes and the demand and growth regimes, in order to try to shed some light on what is called in the literature Argentina's macroeconomic policy trap. First of all, I'm going to assess, let's say, the structure of this presentation. First of all, I'm going to introduce the topic and highlight some of the motivations of this study. Second of all, I'm going to present the theoretical framework, which is composed mainly by these two tools from post-Keynesian economics, the demand and growth regime and the macroeconomic policy regime frameworks. Thirdly, I'm going to discuss Argentina's macroeconomy, mainly dividing the analysis between a long-term view, similar to what Alessandro has presented for Italy. And then I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this analysis in order to provide an alternative periodization of Argentina's macroeconomy. And finally, I'm going to present some final remarks or conclude the presentation. Regarding the introduction, on the one hand, as you may already know, demand and growth regimes, as well as macroeconomic policy regimes, have taken some prominence within mainly the post-Keynesian literature. And on the other hand, after the 2000s, there is a fierce discussion regarding Argentina's erratic economic performance, and also related to how to come up with a way out of this macroeconomic trap, as Valdecantos named it in 2020. So this work mainly aims to shed some light on this phenomenon through the post-Keynesian framework, particularly on these demand and growth regimes and macroeconomic policy regimes. The motivation is related to the fact that only few studies have analyzed Argentina's growth regimes, but none of them, at least to my knowledge, have studied its macroeconomic policy regimes. And even though some scholars, or several scholars, actually have studied Argentina's macroeconomic policies or its macroeconomic policy mix in the last decades, none of these studies, again, to my knowledge, have used this framework. The latter, this framework, is composed, as I say, by these two tools, the demand and growth regimes, which are composed of two, let's say, descriptive analyses. Firstly, we assess demand and growth sources of a given economy, in this case, Argentina, and then we measure how demand is financed, as Alessandro also performed for Italy. We have these four ideal types, let's say, the export-led mercantilist regime, the weakly export-led, domestic demand-led, and debt-led private demand boom regime. And the theoretical framework is complemented by this macroeconomic policy regime tool, which aims to map fiscal, monetary, external, and also wage or income policies in a given economy or region. I add to the discussion the fact that as many studies in post-Keynesian literature have focused on developed economies, there are two elements in this tool, let's say, some core elements related to this literature that I was mentioning that focus on fiscal policy as a tool for stabilize economic activity, monetary policy, which recommend to park the interest rate and to secure financial stability, wage policies that are in charge of the nominal stability of an economy, and finally, the incorporation of the international dimension, which also discuss and recommends to stabilize the exchange rate, not to use it as a tool in line with more or less what the interest rate is in this framework, and also suggest to increase non-price competitiveness, as Alessandro was also discussing in the case of Italy compared to Germany. But there are some peripheric elements, as I call them, or adapted macroeconomic policy regimes for the peripheral economies I will just name a few, but the most important ones are that this notion of a competitive exchange rate, which is argued by several scholars also in some heterodox spaces, is overall contractionary, especially if the economy is wage-led. The importance of trade partners' growth, since they are the ones that enhance, in a sense, exports of other countries. And finally, the fact that most peripheral economies, or all of them, I would say, have a low currency premium, which on the one hand affects the dynamics or the determinants or the evolution of capital flows. And also they set this low currency premium, set a floor for the interest rate, which more or less affects or interferes on this recommendation in the core elements regarding parking the interest rate at a more or less low level. Having presented the theoretical framework, I comment the results of this investigation. First, under this, let's say, long-term view analysis, observing unemployment, inflation, and GDP growth, we can observe or we can assess how there are, to the period that I'm interested in, which is from 2002 to 2019, that there are two cycles that we can identify that are divided through the global financial crisis. And this is in line with many characterization of different economies and even with the Argentina's demand and growth regime assessment. And to complement this, we can also see that these two cycles are also visible when observing or analyzing the current account balance of the Argentinian economy from 2002 until 2009, and again from 2010 until 2019. Following the demand and growth regime and the macroeconomic policy regime framework, I assess the demand and growth regime for Argentina in these two periods. From 2002 until 2009, we have an export-led mercantilist regime, which is very much connected with Argentina's macroeconomic policy regime in this period. Particularly, we can see on the monetary policy stance, the first sign is to assess the stance if it's contractionary or expansionary. And in the case for Argentina, it was a contractionary stance in this period. And the second sign is for the strength of capital controls, which were in place at that time. External policy was contractionary, given a huge depreciation in 2002, namely. And then wage policy stance and fiscal policy were more or less balanced in this period, and all of these contributing to this export-led mercantilist demand and growth regime. And in the second period, we have a domestic demand-led demand and growth regime, which is also related to the macroeconomic policy regime of this period. We can see how monetary policy became expansionary, external policy stance, in the case of this wage-led economy, became also expansionary as the exchange rate, the real multilateral exchange rate appreciated, although the non-price competitiveness decreased. Wage policy stance was, or failed, let's say, as a nominal stabilizer, but it did manage to increase the wage share. And then fiscal policy was overall very procyclical, but most of the years expansionary. So this show how the transition from an export-led mercantilist demand and growth regime to a domestic demand-led regime was related very much to the macroeconomic policy regime and the shift in these macroeconomic policy regimes in the two periods. Having said that, I argue that the analysis of both demand and growth regimes and macroeconomic policy regimes in these periods in Argentina does not take into account some changes within the periods. Several scholars have acknowledged or argue that there is a diversity of macroeconomic configurations in the first period, in this 2002 and 2009 period. And most importantly, I would say when we analyze the Argentinian economy using this periodization, we are combining in the second period two governments that have very different, radical difference in their, let's say, political intentions or approach, and also on the economic policies that they apply. And several scholars also highlight this fact. So I argue that even though this broad periodization can be helpful, it might hide more than it shows. And this is the motivation for me to perform or to construct an alternative periodization of the Argentinian macroeconomy in the last 2 decades. And in order to construct this alternative periodization, I am based on some political facts that happen in the Argentinian economy in several years, but mostly in regulation theory studies that characterize the mode of regulation and the mode of accumulation in Argentina in the last 2 decades, and also how they interact with the dominant social bloc and therefore with the performance of the Argentina's macroeconomy. And when we use this new periodization, we can see that it is more or less in line with the results that we obtain in the broad, in the, let's say, long-term view. But now we can see more clearly the transition between this export-led mercantilism to a domestic debt Lehman regime in 2010 and 2015, and also the abrupt change when the government, when the administration, a new administration, take office in 2016. Very briefly, we can say that from 2002 to 2005, we have this more or less contractionary macroeconomic policy regime, especially in the monetary policy and external policy, and a balanced wage policy and fiscal policy, which can explain this export-led mercantilist model or regime, sorry. But afterwards, the next 2 periods show a change in this macroeconomic policy regime, namely in a more expansionary monetary policy stance and external policy stance, and with the wage policy failing as a nominal stabilizer, but on the contrary, continue to increase the wage share, which in a sense, these 3 changes combined with the pro-cyclical but expansionary fiscal policy stance can explain this transition from the 2002 and 2005 export-led mercantilist model to a weekly export-led in the next period, and finally a domestic demand-led demand and growth regime in 2010 and 2015. Besides this transition, and as I already argued, in 2016 and 2019, the last period under analysis, the macroeconomic policy regime changed radically, and even though monetary policy remained somehow expansionary, and I will come back to this maybe, this problem of measuring the long-term interest rate in Argentina, the rest of the macroeconomic policy regime changed abruptly, and suddenly external policy was very contractionary, as well as the wage policy and the fiscal policy. So we can see how somehow it came back to the 2006 and 2009 period. But as Alessandro brought into the debate, this last period was not able to achieve growth in contrast to the 2006 and 2009 period. So it was somehow a weekly export-led, but more related to slashing imports through depreciation, and thus not enhancing growth as in the 2006 and 2009 period. I will briefly comment some of the conclusions of this study, which, as I said, was part of my master thesis, namely the more, let's say, macroeconomic part of it. First of all, as I already explained, demand and growth regimes and macroeconomic policy regimes show a clear relationship during the period studied, or that I studied. But somehow we can observe that it does not consider changes within the periods, and this is the main motivation to provide an alternative periodization to this study. And given this, or under this new periodization, we can shed some light on first the transition between 2002 and 2015, both in the demand growth regimes and the macroeconomic policy regimes, but also in their abrupt change after 2016. And well, as you may notice during the presentation, this investigation is not free of limitations because, and this motivates further research, especially regarding the theoretical framework. It should not be considered as the final adapted macroeconomic framework for peripheral economies, but rather as a mere theoretical starting point, which continues the work of other scholars in this regard. I agree, I argue, and this is in my master thesis, that we should address the subordinated financialization phenomenon, especially for peripheral economies, given the importance of capital flows and its link with the way that economies finance current account deficits, or even the autonomy of capital flows despite current account positions. And something that I aim to do in my master thesis, although I think it should be more correctly done, or it requires, as I said, further research, is to connect more strongly post-Keynesian analysis and regulation theory, since even though we can connect macroeconomic policy regimes on or with demand and growth regimes and how both are linked and they change together, I think that we should do, or we should consider why these macroeconomic policy regimes change and who are the agents or the dominant social bloc behind these changes, and at the same time, I would say how macroeconomic policy regimes and the outcome of them affect these political alliances and also their sustainability, given that different demand and growth regimes produce different outcomes, and this could determine the sustainability of a given political alliances and also determine or influence at least their configuration. So overall, this is my paper and my presentation. I think I'm looking forward for all the comments and questions that you have, and also looking forward for the discussion. Thank you very much.